Hello folks, and welcome to the third video in City of Swans pixel art course, taught by me, Rin. In this video, we'll be taking a look at animating. We'll cover the 12 basic principles of animation that Disney uses, and how to make animations for games. Strap yourself in. Animating can take some time, but the results are almost magical. You're creating life out of drawings. Let's get started. I'm going to talk about the 12 principles of animation for a bit. This is a list of things good animations have, and it was created by Disney animators Ollie Johnston and Frank Thomas for a book in 1981. The book is widely regarded by most animators to be almost a bible of animating advice, and these principles are known and used by great animators. Firstly, squash and stretch. This is the first principle because of its importance. Squash and stretch is how an object deforms when it's moving. The most classic example is a bouncing ball. The important thing to keep in mind with realistic animation is the object must keep its total size. If it lengthens wide, it must shrink somewhere else. Secondly, anticipation. In simple terms, anticipation is actions that help the viewer's attention expect the next action, like somebody bending their knees before jumping or looking off screen before something enters. This helps the viewer subconsciously prepare and know where to look before something new happens, and also helps give weight to big actions. Thirdly, staging. This principle uses some of the lessons we learned in the last video. Staging is how you lead the eye to the most important things in the scene, using things like light, position, colour, and indication. You can be as subtle or as obvious about this as you need. Fourthly, straight ahead action and pose to pose. These are two methods of creating an animation. Straight ahead is what it sounds like. You start animating and keep going forward. This is good for dynamic action-filled scenes. Pose to pose is where you set up certain poses at certain points and then animate between them. This method is good for elaborate scenes and scenes with a lot of emotion. This animation I use straight ahead action so the ball would look more natural. In this scene, I'll use pose to pose to animate in between the two poses I really need to capture. Fifthly, follow through and overlapping action. Follow through describes how things attached to the body will continue moving after the main body has stopped, like hair will swoosh after a head is turned. Overlapping action is closely related and talks about how parts of the body move at different speeds, though this part of the principle is more used in high-level animation to create a very realistic result. Sixthly, slow in and slow out. This method describes how objects move from standing still, which is slowly, gaining more speed as they move. A train leaving a station will take time to speed up, and when we animate something like that, we show this gradual speed gain by drawing more frames when the object is slow and less when it's fast. Seventhly, arc. Arcs are the paths movements take when they flow smoothly. The pendulum from the last animation is a good example. This one takes a U-shaped path. If it diverged from its arc, it'd look like something was very wrong with gravity. It can be hard to figure out what the natural arc is for body movements, but that's where the benefit of being a human comes in. You have your very own body right there. Good animators use themselves to act out hard movements, and that helps them figure out how to animate them. Eighthly, secondary action. This principle describes the little background animations that exist to support the main animation, like arms swinging or kept in pockets when walking. These little touches give the animation personality and help reinforce the main animation. It's very important the secondary actions don't draw attention away from the main action. They're there to help support it. Ninthly, timing. Simply timing is when things happen, although it's one of the most important factors in making something look realistic. You need to have a lot of references and study a lot to figure out when the right timing is for all different kinds of things. When you get really good at animating the right timing, you can start to break the rules and use timing to create personality in a character, like Wile E. Coyote hovering for a few seconds to make a face before falling. Tenthly, exaggeration. Exaggeration is how far past reality you want to push the animation, and it's something that can be adjusted for personal taste. The authors of these principles worked for Disney and had very specific levels of exaggeration they were used to, which is just past reality but not too far. There are all kinds of animations out there that have varying levels of exaggeration, so it's good to explore where you'd like to be. 11thly, solid drawing. This is one of the things that an animator will pick up over the course of studying animation, and it's an understanding of 3D objects and how they move. If you wanted to animate a person sword fighting realistically, it would be days of watching videos and studying how they move, where their feet are, and how their muscles move. One particular thing the authors warned against was creating people and objects that twinned. Twinning is when one side mirrors the other, so if a person was putting on a hat, the arms should move at different times to avoid twinning. I'll link to a great video that explains a little more about twinning and animation principles in the description below. 12thly and lastly, appeal. Appeal is how much you like a character. They're not necessarily always the good guys either. Villains and bad guys can have a lot of appeal while still being terrible people, but it's how much you like the look of them or their personality. Some neat tricks to making a character more appealing are to make them mostly symmetrical, simple, or childlike. Complicated faces and poses are often harder to read and can make the audience like them less, simply because they can't quickly figure out what a character is thinking or feeling. So I've talked a lot about the animation principles, and they were mostly designed for the kind of 2D animation that Disney used before they switched to using computer models. Let's talk about pixel art animation, and the kind we'll be doing today. Pixel art animation is mostly used in games, but it can also be used just for artistic purposes. It tends to be simpler than hand-drawn 2D animation, but on the downside, it's harder to express emotions and complex movements. The program we're using has a few tools to make animating easier, and those include the frame rate bar, onion skin button, and this looping animation previewer. Let's go through these tools in a little more detail. Frames are these boxes here along the side. You draw your picture in here and then gradually change it in the different frames to create movement in your picture. The frame rate is how quickly each of the frames is played, and you can change it here with this slider. Something to keep in mind with changing the frame rate is the standard number. Most films will animate to 24 frames per second. This gives a really fluid movement, but is a lot more time intensive. Most non-film will be at a lower number, but something to keep in mind is how to pick that number. You'll see in most of my animations I've used 4, 6 and 8 frames per second depending on how fluid I wanted the movement to be. There isn't a strong rule on picking a frame rate, but if you're making animations for a game, every animation has to be the same speed or things will look wrong. So the best method I've found is to figure out what the most complicated animation will need and animate everything else to that frame rate. The most complicated animation is often, but not always, the main character's movements. Next up is the onion skin button. This button enables you to see a faint image of the last frame you drew, and it's really helpful when you want to make small movements based on the last frame, like in the case of a moving ball. Early animators would often work on light tables so they could see the last drawing easily, and used very thin, almost see-through bits of paper to do rough animations on. This is where the button gets its name from. Lastly, the animation previewer here is really handy. It lets you take a look at what your animation looks like as a finished product before exporting it. You'll notice that it plays the animation over and over. This is called looping. Looping animations are really handy when it comes to making animations for games, as most animations will either be played over and over, or used in what's called an animation state. An animation state is where the character or object can move from one type of animation, like a character's idle animation, to a walking animation with the push of a button, and back to idle or into a jump with another push. For your third assignment, I'd like you to create a walk cycle for a character. This character can be as flamboyant or as realistic as you'd like. You could even make it of someone you know or yourself. I've provided a file with a blank character walking if you'd like a little help to get started on the animation. But there's no pressure to use it. If you don't use this template, please keep in mind I'd like this animated to 4 frames a second, because we'll be doing something with this character in the next video. That's all for today. I hope you learned something new and are excited to get in there and start practicing animation.